Sometimes the kind of visuals that stop you and it's like staring at the sky in the night. Nothing's happening, it just stars twinkling, but there is a certain beauty to that frame, right? So I'm more of a seeker of those kind of frames rather than the technical expertise or the greatness from a standpoint of how many things were moving in that frame and whether the lighting came from this angle or that angle or how the face was lit. Yeah, yeah, all of that is obviously fine and great. But to me, the composition is the one that I pay the most attention to. For me, composition first and everything else later.
Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to a brand new season of Photo Country, your favorite photography podcast. And I'm your host, Rajiv. Before we begin, I want to thank all those who have been regular listeners to this podcast. Thank you for all your support. For this opening episode in 2025, I caught up with my friend, colleague, and fellow photographer, Ravishankar, aka the Wrong Side Rascal, as he calls himself on Instagram. He's a veteran of the advertising industry, currently based out of Singapore. In this conversation, we explore his journey, our mutual love for composition, and our approach to photography. So, without further ado, here is Mr. Ravishankar. So, Ravi, thanks for coming on the podcast. It's been a while.
Thank you, Rajiv. It's a
Yeah.
pleasure.
Yeah. So, what's this newfangled hobby that you have, photography? Talk to me about it.
It's not new. I must have started photography around 2004. So it is older than my teenage son as a hobby. I first went to a photographer in Bangalore, used to run weekend classes. You'd have these week-long workshops, 10-day long workshops, which was like an introduction to the foundation, the basics of photography. That's where it's
Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to Photo Country Season 3. And I'm your host, Rajiv. Before we begin, I want to thank all those who have been regular listeners to this podcast. Thank you for all your support. Without your support, for this opening episode, I caught up with my friend, colleague, and fellow photographer, Ravishankar, aka the Wrong Side Rascal, as he calls himself on Instagram. He's a veteran of the advertising industry, currently based out of Singapore. In this conversation, we explore his journey, our mutual love for composition, and our approach to photography. So, without further ado, here is Mr. Ravishankar. Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to Photo Country Season 3. And I'm your host, Rajiv. Before we begin, I want to thank all those who have been regular listeners to this podcast. Thank you for all your support. For this opening episode in 2025, I caught up with my friend, colleague, and fellow photographer, Ravishankar, aka the Wrong Side Rascal, as he calls himself on Instagram. He's a veteran of the advertising industry. Currently based out of Singapore. In this conversation, we explore his journey, our mutual love for composition, and our approach to photography. So, without further ado, here is Mr. Ravishankar.
kicked off, but where it really took a leap was at the end of that foundational course. He brought in a sort of a guest photographer to walk us through his work, how he sees things, and so on and so forth. When I saw his pictures projected on the large wall, that's when I really fell in love with photography. That's when I really started looking at pictures more than just being pictures as being mediums to capture images that come stuck and become a part of your memory escape. I've always enjoyed the visual arts in the sense that when I watch a movie, what stands out to me, what I really enjoy movies, besides, of course, the quality of writing, is the visuals. I always am awestruck by some of the frames about the beauty of the landscape those frames capture. Sometimes, of course, the people and so on and so forth. So I guess it was always there. And it was about finding somebody who could unlock that interest. And I've been on and off it. I've been practicing just as a hobbyist, not as a no capacity as a professional, obviously, but I wouldn't even say in any capacity as a very serious photographer. But as a hobbyist, I've been practicing it for since 2004. So that makes it roughly about 21 odd years now.
I never knew that sort of you when we were both working together in Goa because I never saw you with a camera.
Yes, that's true. Those are the moments in some ways that you regret because you left behind some core hobbies, which are more than just hobbies. They are a part of your personality because of many other things, because you got drawn into or sucked into other things. So even in Goa, I think much before you came in the first couple of years, I used to do a lot of photography. Me and Dileepan, we used to take off on treks, very impromptu treks, and both of us would carry our cameras and we would do a lot of photography. Those were very memorable trips, both for the journey as well as the photographic results from those journeys. Even while in Goa, I used to do a lot of it, but then leadership happened, and with that, a lot of things just went to the background. So, fair enough. I think I may not have displayed my love for photography in a very evident visual manner back then. But yes, it was always there. And much later than when I went to the US, I also picked up my first mirrorless. And prior to that, I was always shooting film. So the mirrorless was my first introduction to the digital world. And from there, again, it's picked in fits and starts. But I think the past 5 odd years since I've moved to Singapore has been much more productive in terms of my photography ambitions.
It's ironic because both of us working in a very visual medium never picked up the camera.
I think in that sense you picked it up much later, but your dedication to it and your the way you always get into things very deeply was again evident through your love of photography. In that sense, I think you married young. The photographer. I choose to say keep flirting and going back and coming back, coming again and going back. So, yeah, I guess that was not perhaps a time that you had involved yourself with photography as deeply as you do now.
I was always around cameras, right? As part of the job.
Yeah, but you viewed it as much more technically, more from a I will film, I will this, I will that, but you never stepped foot as a creator, as the person capturing the visuals, which I think
Absolutely.
happened, if I'm not wrong, only around the time you moved to New Zealand and then
Absolutely. 100% was an accident. I was at I think, a party or a gathering of friends, and somebody dropped a camera on my lap and said, take some photographs. And that's the way it happened, actually. Then they were not using the camera. I started using the camera. Then finally, I picked up a $200 used camera and it just took off from there. It was one of those, I don't know, happy accidents, I would say. Why didn't I do this long back?
I guess there is the element of, I don't know what would be the right word for it, but there is this element of artistic appreciation that you have innately and that sort of starts getting stoked as you handle a camera, start taking pictures, and then you start comparing it to some of the good work out there. And then you see, oh my God, why didn't I see things this way or that way? Which then furthers your ambition. That's very much how it happened for me as well. Yeah.
Very, what's the word? Serendipitous?
Yeah, it is. It is. Speaking for myself, for sure, it was serendipitous, possibly for you as well. But I do know many others I think, who've gone into it in a very deliberate manner. When I say deliberate, I don't mean deliberate as in force, but deliberate as in their love for visuals has been very thick and visible. There's a young photographer that I'm aware of. I don't know him personally, but he must be 17 or 18 now. But I think I've been seeing his pictures from since the time he must have been 14 or 15. And amazing work, the kind of work that you really think that would be coming from a very experienced, very senior photographer, but really beautiful kind of work. So I would assume that in his case, it would be a very deliberate love affair from a very young age. His father must have handed him a camera and say, "Hey, wanna have fun?" The kid tries it, loves it, and then just goes deep into it and gets better and better. So yeah, my case definitely said, look, it is.
You were talking about films earlier. Did you see any film lately which, from a cinematography point of view, how they've used the visuals and the framing to move the story?
I wouldn't put it that way, Rajiv. I think my view of art is, and I not just in the context of photography or cinematography or films, also in the context of music, also in the context of any form of art. I always look at things as being far more accessible and immediate and arresting. Doesn't matter whether it is moving the plot forward, doesn't matter if it's from an apprentice or whatever. The reason I'm saying this is that happens to me pretty much every time I watch a movie. When I walk out of a movie theater, my yardstick for whether this movie is good or bad is essentially built around elements of, was the writing good? Was the cinematography good? Largely, of course, acting as well, but you can, in many cases, you can even pardon not great acting, but you can't pardon writing and cinematography and editing, the three key, in my opinion, right? So every good film that I've watched from that yardstick. Last few weeks ago, I revisited a film that is very close to my heart. It's called Ship of Theseus, and I don't know who the cinematographer is for that movie, but the visuals, the frames in those movie in that movie was, as far as I'm concerned, it was arresting. Visually maintained the same pace as the film goes in terms of writing, right? It's visually it's not hurried, whereas the writing is slow paced and easy paced, or whichever ways you look at it, right? So I think there was a great match. There were a lot of frames in that movie that still stay back with me. I was just watching series the last evening on Prime, and again, great work of writing, some brilliant visuals in that too. Very poetic. Sometimes the kind of visuals that stop you, and it's like staring at the sky in the night, right? Nothing's happening. It's just stars twinkling, but there is a certain beauty to that frame, right? So I'm more of a seeker of those kind of frames rather than the technical expertise or the greatness from a standpoint of how many things were moving in that frame and whether the lighting came from this angle or that angle or how the face was lit. Yeah, yeah, all of that is obviously fine and great. But to me, the composition is the one that I pay the most attention to. For me, composition first and everything else later. So, to answer your question again in short, every good film, I believe, will have great cinematography. And therefore, not one, but every good film that I walked out of will have frames that I will always recollect and go back to. I sometimes even rewatch films purely for going back and watching those frames again.
To me, good cinematography is that you don't notice it
Yeah.
in the sense that it doesn't stand out in the sense, oh, it's a great shot. Like you're so involved, it tells the story. So, talking about Singapore, I always thought Singapore was a great place for street photography. Is there space for doing landscape in a place like Singapore?
Well, depending on the way you look at it, look, there is a space for doing landscape. Singapore has very nice landscape in many ways. But then again, is there a specific type of landscape that you're looking for? Singapore is very manicured. It's not going to give you raw landscapes, for example, something that you would get in India or Malaysia or Indonesia, stuff like that, right? So landscapes here tend to be that much more organized, structured. You can make beautiful frames, maybe the Wong Kar Wai kind of frames, and less like the Drishyam kind of frames because of the nature of this country. But you're right, it's a great place for street. Then again, my sense is that in a place like Singapore, there is going to be a natural boundary or a constraint for how much of street will happen. Yet again, because it's a very structured, very ordered society, right? So it is difficult to see unexpected stuff beyond a certain range or a boundary of unexpectedness, right? Can you spot somebody walking on the street without a shirt? Yeah, sure, you can. But you've done it once, you've done it twice. After that, what? Right? You can't keep repeating looking for shirtless people walking on the street. You'll have great shots of very old people playing mahjong or the Chinese checkers and stuff like that. But how many of that? So what does tend to happen here is that the unexpected is very limited in its scope. There is obviously a lot much more for like me or even many other photographers to discover, but it increasingly becomes needle in the haystack. It's not as easy as just, okay, let's walk around with the camera. We'll find 20 different visuals that will make for a great story. Beyond a point, you'll be often repeating the same thing time and again. Also, because of the geographical limitation, Singapore is that big and not more. But yeah, it's within that boundary, some great stuff to be done in street. You will cover most of the landscape. If you are a very avid photographer, like how you are, for example, I dare say you will cover it in maybe a couple of months. If you're not so avid and if you're going to take more time and allow your laziness also to creep in very regularly, like I do, you may spend about a year covering most of the landscape, right? But the thing is that when you, for example, walk into a nature trail, that's beautiful. There's a lot, but it's manicured. Even the nature trail is manicured, right? So will be one odd trail that will have some elements of raw, but that's it, one odd, maybe two, maybe three. But you go into, let's say in India, Malaysia, and Indonesia, you're going to find literally much, much more unexpected stuff because people are breaking rules all the time. So when people are breaking rules, you as a viewer have so much more to capture and put forth. Maybe a opinion that many Singaporeans may not like, but it is what it is.
True, it's a very organized society. There are good and bad things about it, but it
Yeah.
is what it is. But in such a scenario, how do you practice your photography?
So for me, what happens is, which is the reason I sort of had to expand my genre repertoire because beyond a point, she didn't necessarily get me kicked up every weekend. Earlier, I remember when I just moved into Singapore, every weekend, Saturday or Sunday, I would take my camera, board the MRT, I'd go click on the MRT, in the stations, on the streets, finding places, finding people doing things, hawker centers, wet markets. But like I said, if you're an avid photographer, you're going to cover all of that in maybe a couple of months, and there's not much. One wet market is pretty much unlike another wet market. It's not going to be two distinct wet markets with completely different fields. So then comes landscape. Okay, let's explore. Let's go here. Let's cover the Marina Barrage. Let's cover the flyer. Let's look at this building. Let's look at that building. Let's go on the nature trail. Then what? So then is where I decided to start trying my hand at portraiture as well. Also because in some sense I had this urge to stick to photography. It does give me a lot of joy. It does take my mind away from the regular pulls and pushes of life. But what do you do if there are two elements which of laziness, right? One is your natural laziness, which stops you from getting up and going out, and the other element of laziness is I'm ready to get up and go out, but where? What? I mean, mentally, I need to be also as kicked up about trying to discover something more, something new, and it's not necessarily coming thick and fast at you. So that's where I decided that let me try portraiture. I have a good friend here who's also a photographer, and I met him at one of these photo walks. It was less of a photo walk and more of a introduction to portraiture organized by one of these brands, I think Sony, if I'm not wrong. I met him there and we generally became friends. And over the years, he developed a lot of interest in doing fashion photography and portraiture photography. And I keep seeing his work and I kept seeing how much he kept improving over the years. And then we met at another photo walk, and then he spoke about lack of space to do indoor photography. That's one thing I was very lucky about. I have a space that can easily be converted into a sort of a studio, and not a large one, not a unlimited one, but decent size and comfortable enough to do basic indoor stuff. And we decided to collaborate. And then he's also outgoing. He was able to get a couple of models to come over and I tried my hand at it, and I really loved the whole process. I love the process of rigging up. I love the process of doing, for example, the aspects of using flash and lights and all of it was completely beyond me. I had never done it in my 20 odd years earlier. And this was pretty much the first time I even bought that gear. I bought a flash and I bought lights and everything. And that was the progression into, to answer your question, into how do I keep myself occupied as a photographer. So now I'm trying to practice more of that, because here, unlike the previous problem that I mentioned about landscape and street, every person is new. While the art might be the same, but every person is new. Every personality comes with their own. And I'm very keen to try out portrait photography in a slightly different space, in the sense that rather than fashion or headshot kind of photography, I want to try what we could term as organized, candid, or I don't know. Sometimes I've heard it being referred to as intimate photography. Intimate, not in the context of boudoir, but intimate in the context of looking at people as they are, letting them be, and really getting them into physically vulnerable states and then capturing that through the lens. Maybe not physically, more mentally, maybe, so that they allow themselves through their actions to reflect what they truly feel at that moment, not necessarily stand with the hip on their arms like they are like these big bosses, but maybe give us more reflective looks, or probably more reflective of that moment, how they feel. That's something that has got me very excited. I'm very kicked up about inviting more people to help me learn and then practice more of that. So that's how I'm trying to stay with the camera and not just put it back into the box again.
Mm. Have you thought of doing a series? Say, for example, taking an idea and shooting a narrative with intent?
I mean, if you look at the landscape Singapore, and I'm thinking about what are the things that constantly appear on this landscape in the streets, right? So, for example, people are very health conscious. So, you'll find a lot of people running all the time. There are great outdoor spaces for running. You could do a series on runners. You could do a series on cyclists. You could do a series on hands and legs, for example. I remember once when I just started street here, and I was telling you about how I used to carry the camera every weekend. I must have shot at least one weekend only people in trains glued to their phones as a set of pictures. Some are very nice. Then the some of the quirks, actually not quirks, but the cultural or the way Singaporeans are in terms of queues, for example, they will always stand in a line for anything and everything. It's I don't know about New Zealand, but obviously where we come from, both of us, idea of queue as a concept is non-existent. Queues, and sometimes those queue formations themselves are really quite interesting. They stretch really long lunchtime queues, and yet people will stand in them patiently, not worried about the fact that they are out in the sun, losing their time, blah blah blah. Another one that I can think of is what you call how they always form this line on escalators, standing to the left. And if you don't want to walk up an escalator, you don't want to climb, you just want to be static and stand. And many things which I think are perhaps more quite reflective of Singapore. And I think, yeah, that's a great thought. If you did go into it with intent, I'm sure you can find lot much more than just light and shadow patterns. And I haven't thought of them as a series. Like I told you about the MRT thing, it's one picture. Wet market, man chopping some meat, one picture. Feets, one picture. But not as a series. Shirtless man, one picture. So, one. Yeah, good thought. Yeah.
But I think if you do it as a series, then it's a lot more fun. You tell a story about it. So after my visit to India,
Yeah,
I've been doing like these photo essays. It brings a narrative to my photography. It's not individual images at
that's
all.
nice. So, what's your idea of what would be your number one thing when it comes to a picture?
I'll give you an example. I went to Tirumala Nayakar Mahal in Madurai, right? Like I didn't want to photograph the standard the way you usually shoot. I love the expanse of the huge space that it is, and it is really sunny outside. So then I decided I will
overexpose my photographs. So, and play on
So that was
silhouettes.
a deliberate choice to overexpose in the light of a sunny sort of a day. That's
Correct.
Hmm.
So that captured the expanse and it showed the geometrical lines as well, because that's the whole point of that thing. Long, big pillars, those geometrical arches and stuff like that. And then people there and light is streaming in from outside. So my thing is like, how do you then portray that space and give that experience? So the good photograph actually makes you feel that you're there. That's my view of a good photograph. It draws you in. You almost
Yeah, yeah.
feel that it's so immersive.
So for me, what happens often is that the number one disappointment for me in any picture that I take is if it is compositionally not appealing enough for me, from my perspective. Of see, I one thing that I figured out in all the pictures that I've been taking over the last 20 plus years is that pictures that I think personally are really the ones that I cherish. Let's say I opened my photo book right now and asked you to pick my 5 best pictures. I'm fairly certain this is not specifically speaking about you. Could be anybody, not you. Could be Dileep, could be Suresh, Vivek, anybody. The 5 pictures that you would pick from my photo book would be very different from the 5 pictures that I pick. And so I've noticed that the my favorite pictures, my most favorite pictures, aren't necessarily what somebody else thinks are great pictures. But I remember very distinctly there is this set of pictures from Rajasthan from many years ago, 2005, where I was really enjoying toying with this idea of taking pictures from a very low angle upwards. And I shot a few pictures and I looked them up and I said, boss, I've arrived. That's how good I felt they were. Of course, there were some references that I had for similar pictures. And I really liked it because I personally thought they're telling you a street scene. The pictures are showing you a street scene. They by themselves are interesting, and also it's not the subjects in the picture are posing for it. They're just going about doing something, and I've just captured that one microsecond and got it in my camera and in my phone book. The thing that I'm coming to, however, is that the pictures that I really get disappointed about are the pictures that I don't feel are great compositions as a whole. So for me, the challenge is always about I'm out to shoot something. How the hell did I screw this up so badly from a compositional perspective? What is it that sort of went wrong here? Why did it happen? And that is so disappointing because in discarding that picture, I'm literally discarding that memory because having gone and not having been captured in my camera. So
Okay, I'll tell you a story. Henry Cartier-Bresson has a famous photograph of this guy jumping a puddle. You must have seen it. So that photograph is not the only photograph of that scene. So if you look at the contact sheet of that session, there's probably 10 or 15. And then he chose this. Okay. So my point is, what we think of composition itself is not a single entity. So I was talking to a photographer, and that's when this thing came up. And she was saying, if you're going about watching life, right? And when you go and see a composition, it's just not one photograph. So it's a canvas. You might take a photograph from eye level, the same composition. Then you might recompose and take it maybe closer to that composition, or maybe further away, or maybe from a low angle, or maybe portrait, maybe landscape. But the composition you see is in front of you. So it can be many things. So when I started out, I didn't realize that. But today I realize it. When I see something, I don't just take one photograph. I see it, I take a photograph, then I go 2 steps forward, take another photograph, go 2 steps backward, take another photograph, take 2 steps to the right, 2 steps to the left, then maybe change the angle, maybe do a portrait. Landscape, I explore all the things that I have in my hand, and you don't know which one will turn out good.
interesting. Yeah.
So that's the thing I do today. Then it becomes a series of that canvas. Then I pick and choose which one is tells a story or which is better. Otherwise, you just take one photograph and then move on. You're losing a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, but that's what goes back again to that intent, the deliberate act of getting a picture, which I see. But sometimes there are those moments, what Henry calls as the decisive moment, right? For example, where I live, there is this nice balcony in my home, and Shanghai airport is very close, and you can always see flights landing and taking off, right? Not actually landing and taking off, but approaching the landing and taking off. And you have flights coming in from all directions. So there is the flight that comes closest to my balcony, and then there are these two other condos which are right in front of my tower, and that forms a sliver of sky between those two condos which are in front. And you see this flight landing, and it positions itself between these two condos and
Mm.
then goes landing. So there is this particular flight, that series of flights that take the closest path to my condo. And exactly at that time, and they're between these two condos, they appear like a really giant thing in the sky, right? The size of aeroplanes being what they are.
Mm.
And then there are ones that are farther and farther. Sometimes they're specks, sometimes they are giants. And then there is this amazingly rainy day. It's and how it used to happen in Goa here again. Same thing. It suddenly will start raining and pour like crazy, right? And your visibility will be like very the same. It'll be very hazy. And here I am standing in the balcony, and I see this big ass flight that sort of comes, positions itself right between these two condos, and it's landing. It's huge, and it's raining and it's hazy. And what would otherwise be a very clear sight becomes a sort of like I don't know what's the right word to use, like a mirage kind of a thing. It's hazy, and you can see a shape. It's black and white without it really being a black and white picture out there. And you don't need to switch your camera to black and white more. It becomes so black and white at that time, right? The sky is dark, and so in that moment, that's it. That moment, will it come again? Of course, it will come again. But will I be there again to watch it raining, the flight coming exactly from this direction, positioning itself, raining so heavily that it appears like this mirage? And so that's where I meant. See, I hear you when you're out there to shoot with an intent, and you can construct a scene. You can sometimes I also urge myself to go on deliberate photo seeking opportunities. What I mean by that is to go sit some place and look at things, and sometimes even imagine things as I might want to see them. For example, a leaf fallen somewhere or a flower fallen somewhere, and I want to shoot it in a certain way, light falling on it in a certain direction and lighting up a certain color on it. That's the act of deliberation and constructing a scene. But here, I'm not constructing the scene. The scene is constructed. I just have to be at the right place at the right time with the right camera, at the right focal length and everything, and click, right? So that's what I meant. So for me, I've been trying to shoot that scene for I know. I mean, that could actually be a series. I have a series of pictures of these two condos and of the trying to get the flight in the right place and position. That's what I meant in terms of them being compositionally so disappointing, because also the natural constraint is that that balcony is where it is. I can't lift that balcony up or bring it down. I can't take it forward or bring it back. It is where it is. My camera is what it is. I practice it still with a mirrorless and a fixed length and whatever. So it's all those constraints done. That's where what I meant from a compositional disappointment. We don't have a choice to construct it. It is a you only have a choice to capture it. So
Yeah,
that's what I
yeah.
meant.
I've heard this one guy who describes the difference between painting and photography. Is painting
Mm.
is an additive process, while photography is a subtractive
Now
process.
that's so beautifully put, because I am a big believer of the subtractive process. For me, constantly the urge is, even when I'm editing an image, my first action is to crop. First action is to crop in trying to figure out what can I take away from here and get more and more focused towards the subject, which is again where composition plays a role. How you compose it will also determine how much you will be able to take out of it or leave into it, and so on and so forth. That's why for me, composition is really, personally speaking, the number one thing in a picture. Once I've composed it correctly, then, there are a lot of things that I can try with it. But if I haven't composed it correctly in the first place, then I'm left with what is, and then, it's about salvaging.
And I think the composition comes with intent, because if you don't have intent, you won't compose correctly. If I felt that, otherwise, you
Hmm.
won't have any idea what you're going to shoot. You need to have that visualization thing before you go out on a photo walk. At least a general idea as to
Yeah,
what kind of
correct.
images I want to take today.
Yeah, I mean that's one thing, but I don't know if that sort of closes you to the real charms of street, which is encountering the unexpected. I
No,
think one
actually, see,
example
it's actually.
is I had gone
Uh,
out shooting once in Chinatown, and back then I used to have this thought that okay, today I'm going to visit the wet market. This is what I'm going to shoot, so I'm constructing these type of images, right? And it was a disappointing day for whatever reason. I maybe just wasn't in the right frame of mind, wasn't getting the pictures. I just walked out. And then I crossed this Chinese Buddhist temple, and there is this group of girls who are dressed in this traditional dress. That just happened. That just happened. And is one picture that did get me a lot of reactions from some people that I admire who said, This is a really beautiful picture, right? And that's when I relooked at it and said, God, sometimes it would be just lovely and weather permitting. Of course, you know how Singapore is, gets very hot. I've had so many occasions when I have decided to take the camera out and go walking and then post a nice biryani for lunch. It's like the last thing you want to do is lug around a camera and walk around and just come back. Right. So, weather permitting, those kind of encounters happen. I believe if you just walk around with an open mind, and a good stream of mind.
100%. You have to be prepared for the unexpected. But I'm a big believer in having
Hmm.
visualizing your stuff before you go, because I take it in like in series, so that helps me.
Yeah, I think yeah, in that sense, I'm a bit more of a serendipity lover in that sense, not just in the context of photography. I think generally my approach to life has been more reliant on serendipity.
So just to bookend this conversation, you said that you have a camera with a fixed lens. How's that influenced your photography?
So it wasn't the plan that led to a fixed lens camera. I have this desire to be able to shoot and get a lot of good pictures in low light conditions. So that influenced my search for a camera which would be great under low light. And the one that I eventually bought was affordable. And I also bought it in the second-hand market. So that was what was available at the price that I was willing to pay. And yeah, because I was also exploring street, it worked well for me. But if you ask me honestly, my first camera, which was back then this film camera, Canon, and then I had two lenses. One was a 2470 and a 7300. Personally speaking, I'd rather have a setup with interchangeable lens of that size because just like you said earlier, I'm a man with a camera. Don't fit me into genre saying you will do this or you will do that. I will go on a trip to Ladakh and I'll want to capture some brilliant landscapes for which I will need all kinds of lenses. I will do street, I will do portraiture, I'll do whatever. And I would like to be prepared for all genre, all kinds of photography. I wouldn't say the fixed lens camera has really influenced my photography in that sense. In fact, if anything, I see it as a barrier right now. I see it as a barrier because not being able to get or not being happy with many of the images that I got from a trip like Ladakh is a disappointment. It's a disappointment I live with for a while till I get an opportunity to do that again. I'd have loved it if I had a interchangeable lens camera with a couple of lens options. So yeah, it's not influence. It's really a bit of a boundary or a limit right now. And I'm just looking at something like 2470, 18. In fact, I was exploring 1855 or maybe a 2470. I wouldn't necessarily want to go beyond 100. When I go back to the Canon that I was mentioning, the 300 was, I used it. Those days I was really tripping out on doing double exposures and moons and those kind of things. And 300 was amazing. But that said, the use case for 300 was always limited. I mean, unless you go wildlife and yeah, birding and wildlife, and you also need a great camera, not just a great lens. So yeah, from my perspective, that would have been great. Just 24/70 would have made a world of difference.
Good, good. So, last thoughts. What would you like to close this podcast with?
In my mind, in that sense, in general, it's been a fun conversation between somebody who's. I admire your work a lot from the perspective that as a photographer, your journey is so much more younger than, let's say, mine. And there's so much that you've already done. But importantly, I think it really boils down to looking at photography as transformative process. I like to cook a lot, and I don't cook only because I like to eat, also because in that act of cooking, I find myself often all my stresses, concerns, self doubts, and all my miseries just wash away. I think photography is also in that sense like that. It is a process of creating where the creation also gives you joy. But more importantly, the process of creation brings you so much more of joy and peace and happiness. You feel like you've spent your time well.
All right. Thank you so much. And with that, let's close this conversation. Thanks, Ravi, for coming.
Thank you very much, Rajiv. Really enjoyed this conversation.
So that was a wrap for this episode. You can check out Ravi's photographs on his Instagram channel or on his Flickr channel. I will put the links in the show notes. As always, thank you for supporting this podcast. Do share this podcast with someone who loves photography like we do on this podcast. Better still, join the conversation on my Substack channel, photocountry.co. Join me next week on another fascinating conversation. Till the next episode, stay safe and keep clicking. This is Rajiv signing off.